Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. It's Omar Rodriguez Vila with Georgia Institute of Technology, and he's speaking about work that was done also with Myoung-Jin Chae, doctoral candidate at the Scheller School of Business, as well as Professor Sundar Bharadwaj, who's at the University of Georgia. So Omar is the assistant professor at Georgia Tech. He joined the Scheller College there in the fall of 2012 after getting his PhD from Emory. He also holds an MBA from the Kellogg School at Northwestern and a BS in Public Communications from Syracuse. His research uses a combination of grounded theory and econometric methods to understand the impact of macro-environmental changes on the marketing capabilities of firms. In particular, he studies the impact of sustainability attributes on brand management and brand performance, and the changes in marketing organization structures and processes required for firms to compete successfully in a social and real-time media landscape. And prior to his academic career, Omar held numerous marketing leadership roles at the Coca-Cola Company, including as Global Vice President for Integrated Marketing Communications and Marketing Director for Coca-Cola in China. So he's lived the bridge between business and academia in his career, and we welcome Omar here. Omar?
Thank you very much, Gordon. Hannah, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for making time to participate in this discussion. I hope you find it useful. Again, my name is Omar Rodriguez. I am very grateful to MSI for the support they have given us. They have given this project, and frankly, without which we could not have been able to do it. So thank you so much to MSI. I also want to recognize my two co-authors, Myoung-Jin Chae. She's a doctoral candidate at Scheller College of Business, and she does work in the digital marketing, social media, and social media content. And Sundar Bharadwaj, who's a marketing professor at the University of Georgia. Today we're going to talk about a topic that I think it's been a lot more present in the media than it has been maybe in academic research, and that is the topic of real-time messaging, real-time marketing. And I think most of us have a sense of what this is. It's been a very active tool used by celebrities, politicians, some of which are very, very recently and very famously, but probably became known as a tool for brands in a moment that happened a couple of years ago. And some of you may remember, if you are NFL football fans in the U.S., watching the Super Bowl probably 5 years ago, when the Baltimore Ravens were playing the San Francisco 49ers, and suddenly the lights went off in the stadium, which is really unheard of. Nobody was expecting that an event like the Super Bowl would stop because of electric outage. And at the same time, in that moment, many brands were doing their traditional social media activity around the event, and many of them actually had similar agencies that they shared. But one of them came out with a very intriguing message on Twitter, and I'm sure most of you have heard this. I'm just kind of reminding it to set up the context of our study. And it was Oreo, right? They came out with this tweet talking about the fact that you could still dunk in the dark. And because there was not much to talk about at the time, because people were waiting for the game to start again, and this was about 25 minutes that lasted before the power was reinstalled, suddenly this became the point of conversation. And it took off, and quote unquote, a lot of the commentary after the game, the day after, was saying that actually Oreo was gained more attention or gained significant attention with a tactic that was significantly small compared to the millions of dollars that the brands were spending on advertising during the Super Bowl. Because they were fast, because they were witty, because they were different. And in a way, they were actually leveraging a real-time message, right? This is not something that they could have planned. Nobody could have planned a message like this. They had to improvise in the moment. And since then, brands have been using these tactics over and over. Oftentimes, They tend to use it around events because there's a lot of action that happens that's very concentrated. Very famously, during the World Cup in Brazil in 2014, every time a team won or a team lost, brands would try to associate with that particular outcome. In one particular case, when the Netherlands eliminated Mexico, Lufthansa, of course, issued a message basically saying goodbye to the Mexican team because they were returning home. And this is another interesting point because when Lufthansa did this, I guess, trying to take advantage of the situation, they did not maybe take into account how the fans from Mexico would feel when the brand is talking in that way about their team. So very, very popular celebrities in Mexico like Gael Garcia Bernal took on Twitter immediately and started criticizing Lufthansa for what they did in very crude terms, right? So it really speaks to the risks associated with this communication strategy. That oftentimes what we see in the media, what we see covered in case studies, are things like the Tide program or maybe some examples from Lego during the Oscars. But this is happening all the time. And we learn about the few cases that are very successful and very impactful, and they suggest to be breaking new ground in marketing communications. But what we don't hear is, maybe about the full spectrum of messages that are being managed in this way, and what effect is this strategy really having on consumer engagement in social media. And that was ultimately the question that we wanted to address. Now, the way we define real-time messages is basically criteria that has two elements. First is brand messages that incorporate a transient context. So that is a context that's moving. Either it could be a news event, it could be a cultural moment like a holiday, or it could be a daily occasion. Or importantly, the context is moving, it's not fixed. And second, that context becomes part of the message itself, and the message is published in proximity to that context. So if we go to the example of the Super Bowl, well, clearly that's real time. The message incorporated the context is transient, that was not going to come back in a way, and it was published in close proximity to the situation. Those three criteria define, in our view, what real-time messages are. And this is a practice that has been growing, right? At least the data that we found that from a practitioner publication talked about the fact that this is a practice around events, but in particular the Super Bowl has been growing over a couple of years. More and more brands were using it. The New York Times reported that this was a practice that was increasing in part because companies were seeking for ways to differentiate better in digital media, and particularly mobile, and this offered a way to possibly be more relevant with consumers. And so overall, there is a sense that this is almost like the new way of communicating with consumers, because it's possible and because a lot of brands are doing it. Therefore, it must be effective, and a lot of people are investing significant resources in building capabilities to communicate in real-time manners. Oftentimes, it's an activity that is outsourced to agencies that have centers that have social listening tools that are really enabling content creators to identify trends and immediately produce messages that relate to that particular transient context in pursuit of engagement with the brands, right? And when we started the project, we looked at how has this been dealt with in the academic literature to date, right? And we organized it in two ways. We looked, of course, there's tremendous amount of research in traditional media around content, with different types of content that work or do not work, content strategies and content elements, as well as social media. The literature in social media content and its impact on engagement has been growing tremendously. But the dimension we added was the planned versus real time, because we feel that a lot of the research that has been done on traditional media has been done on traditional forms of managing advertising, which oftentimes are planned, right? I mean, the way that companies develop traditional communications will start with a brief to an agency, will go through several rounds of revision, maybe through some pre-testing, And after that, maybe production, final production, and eventually hits the market, you're talking months of development and content that probably costs thousands of dollars to produce. Now we are in an environment where we're not talking about months of development. We're talking about maybe hours of development with content that possibly will cost hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars, or even more than that. So therefore, there is the opportunity to produce more of it. And what we see is there's a lot more content being created for social media by brands, and a lot of it is being developed in real time. That particular form of content creation, we believe, has not been thoroughly studied yet. In social media, there's a lot of the focus has been more on the plan, not as much on the real time. And in the traditional media, the aspect that is relevant to our research is studies that have been done in innovation, particularly a study by Christine Moorman in the late 90s, where she looked at improvisation in the context of new product development. And the theory that they developed in the study for that work is something that we draw to guide some of our hypotheses and guide actually some of the research that we did. So I'll make that connection later on in the presentation. But when we basically decided to go after this question, we focused on three things. First, there is tremendous amount of discussion on real-time marketing, but almost to the point that it felt like we have skipped the most basic question of all. Is this even effective? It was almost taken for granted that it is, and therefore a lot of people are just simply competing on how to do it. So we wanted to take a step back and say, do real-time messages actually influence consumer engagement in social media? Do we find evidence for that? Separate from the particular examples that we've seen that are very successful, when we put together a large database of these examples, do we find evidence that that's the case? Second, what factors help explain the effect that these messages have on social media engagement? Why is it that these messages may be more engaging or less engaging? And lastly, what content or planning decision can help managers improve the effectiveness of these messages in social media engagement? So what are some moderators or a few variables that content creators should take into account that could increase the chance of getting to higher real-time message engagement? So those were the three things that we focused on and tried to study. And we started with a fairly straightforward conceptual model, right? So we have real-time messages and social media engagement, and we define social media engagement. We'll talk about the variables later, but fairly established forms, right? Using likes, shares, and comments. And at the time, this was before reactions came into Facebook, so we focused on likes. We control for some things like placement characteristics and content characteristics that are really important alternative explanations to take into account. And we then looked at this main effect relationship between real-time messages and social media engagement. And our initial expectation is that for the same reason that prior research in advertising has found that contextual congruency leads to better processing of messages by consumers and therefore a higher probability that they like the message. But we thought that same theory that was used for the fit between advertising and the TV program or an outdoor and the environment, that same theory would apply here. And therefore, we would expect to see a positive effect of real-time messages with social media engagement because they were designed to offer contextual congruency to the audience. Now, to study this question, we had to overcome a couple of tricky aspects. And probably the most challenging of all is actually measuring real-time messages. I'll get to that in a second. The database we use comes from Facebook. We have about a full year, January through September, of 18 different consumer product brands. We started with a database of about 5,000 posts, and eventually we focused on about half of that had specifically real-time messages of different types, and I'll speak to that in a minute, along with messages that were not real-time. And the analysis is done at the post level. We do not observe individual level engagement, so we observe data at the post level. A dependent variable, as I mentioned earlier, is is likes, shares, and comments. And we created the measures through 3 different techniques. We used text analysis for some of the variables that are more straightforward to capture. We used consumer tagging via MTurk on some of the characteristics and the variables that I'm going to show you in a second. And then we worked very closely with the social media agency to establish a measurement for real time. Now, let me explain what the challenge is. The challenge is actually there was a build here that, anyways, there are 2 examples of real-time messages, right? The first one on the left was issued by Oreo as well. This was when the baby of the Prince of England was born. He was a royal baby, right? So Oreo issued this message hours after the baby was born. On the right, you have a message that was done by Snickers. You may recall, and you could probably tell by my examples, that I'm a big football fan. So you may recall the World Cup in 2014, Luis Suarez from the Uruguay team was expelled from the semifinal game or quarterfinal game with Italy because he bit one of the defenders in the back, or actually in the shoulder, which is not something that we see often in a football match or a soccer match. So again, immediately, around that time, Snickers came out with this message saying more satisfying than Italian. And importantly, these are both messages that are real-time, quote unquote, right? Because they are leveraging a transient context and they're being published close to that situation, and they're embedding that transient context into their message. Having said that, there's a very important difference here. The Oreo cookie message, they knew at least 9 months in advance that the royal baby was going to be born around that time, right? So they had time to plan what to say. They had planned to design this message, to actually ask the agency for a number of alternatives, and eventually pick the one that they thought would be better. On the other side, the improvised, there was, yes, it's true, Luis Suarez had been accused of biting defenders twice before in his career, but nobody could expect he would do it again in this match, right? Probably not even him. So this one was completely improvised, right? Similar to the example from the Super Bowl. So we thought that that's actually a very important distinction to take into account. What makes it complex is that we cannot observe this distinction from the outside. I do not know if when I see a message, if it was developed in an improvised manner or if it was not. I can just say that it's connecting to a transient context. I can say that when I observe it. But I need internal view of the process to determine that. And this is a great example because when the World Cup happened in Brazil and Brazil lost 1-7, which was one of the worst defeats ever, and frankly, nobody was expecting that outcome. Great for Germany, but terrible for Brazil. Coca-Cola came out with a message which seemed completely improvised. But the fact was not. That message was created along with a number of different alternatives, which the team had developed weeks in advance, playing different scenarios of what could happen to their national team during the event. And they had 3 to 4 alternatives of what messages to issue if Brazil got eliminated, depending on the way they got eliminated, right? They lost in the first round or second round. And this speaks to something about, how to manage real-time messages and the importance of scenario planning in it. But the point to our research method is that we would have tagged that wrong if we would have looked at this and said that's actually real-time, because it was not. It was not improvised. It was real-time, but it was not improvised. It was planned. So we had to work very closely with the agency to create this supply-side measure, right? And that's our perspective. Right? Our perspective is we want to study the supply side of RTM, and by that we mean how messages were created, right? And so the good thing was that this agency had actually different teams, and these teams managed different brands. There were a total of close to 70 people involved in this process, And each of them managed different brands, and they were very familiar with the posts that were created for each brand because they did them. So they had the information about what process was used when developing each message. And we worked with them a matter of probably a month and a half to go through each post and have them identify if the post was developed through a planned process, which was the traditional process, or if the post was actually improvised. And also the determination if the post was real-time, it was easier because we knew that we could tell if the message was communicated to address a given context. It was easier for them to assess. The harder for us was to determine, was this improvised or was this planned? And we were able to get that information from the agency. And then we had a measure to really not only look at RTM in general terms, but also look at these two different types of RTM, which in fact happen all the time. All the time, sometimes managers know that there's an event coming, like the Olympics or the Oscars, and they have their agencies working on how are we going to react if a particular actor wins or a particular actress win. But then they also are kind of waiting to see what happens, and they need to improvise at times. Both of those capabilities are necessary. So we wanted to look at the differential effect between them. This is just a sense of the type of variables we have. So we have likes, shares, and comments, as you would expect. A lot more likes than share and comments in the database. That's fairly standard. We had in the total database, we had about 13% of the sample that were real-time messages. So even though this is happening, this is not necessarily the majority of the activity that the brands are doing, but it is a strategy that they're clearly applying. We used a number of control variables following really what other scholars have done, particularly Stefan, Tiandra, and Inman in 2015, and Lee, Hosner, and Nair in 2015. Both of them had excellent papers on looking at engagement in Facebook and between content and social media engagement. So we follow a lot of the variables they used as controls to make sure that we accounted for alternative explanations for engagement, right? Things, format elements, information elements, the persuasion orientation, brand fit, all these other factors that literature has already identified as important in driving engagement. And we then looked at, of course, our main variable of interest, which was the presence of real-time messages. This is just the correlation matrix of a variable, just to illustrate the fact that we really don't have a major issue of multicollinearity here. Most of our variables are capturing separate effects in the data set. So we faced a couple of challenges that we had to work through in terms of the nature of the data. And those of you that have worked with social media data are very familiar with it. But distribution of data oftentimes is skewed, both in terms of likes, shares, the same is with comments. So we had multiple alternatives here, and we actually used them pretty much all. I think the results we're going to be showing you today are going to be results of a Tobit model where we did a log transformation on this variable, but we also used negative binomial model after testing for zero inflated option to make sure that our results were consistent. When we get into the specific empirical considerations for our work, there were things that we took into account. The first one I just mentioned, the dependent variable or count variable with large variances but less skewed. So we use the log transformation, which is consistent with what the prior scholars have done as well. And then we also use the negative binomial, as I mentioned. The dependent variables are likely to be correlated, right? So if I like a post, it's more likely that I share it or more likely that I comment on it. So we use a system of equation to run these models simultaneously and estimate the coefficients as such. So that's the results you're going to see are going to be the outcome of the system of equations. The brand marketing capabilities could be different, right? So we have 18 different brands in this sample. Some of them may be better at communicating in social media than others, so we use brand fixed effects to capture that difference. Consumer engagement has been found to also vary by day of the week and time of the year. So in order to capture that, we use day of the week and month fixed effects. The choice of RTM by itself could be a strategic choice. So there could be, and this of course raises the eternal challenge of endogeneity. So it could be that it is just a strategy by one of these brands to use RTM, and it's a choice by managers, and other brands, other managers don't make that choice. So what we are observing in terms of the usage of RTM, the presence of RTM in the sample, is not random. It's actually endogenous, because that choice is being made by the managers. So in order to address that, we did a couple of things. We used the first stage Hegman selection model to estimate the inverse Mills ratio, and we included that in the second stage of the model. And then we also used a control function approach, which is the same solution that Stefan, Siandra, and Iman used in their 2015 paper. And we have results here. I think the results I'm going to show you today are all with this additional considerations, but in the paper we show results with and without, and basically all the findings are consistent, are the same. And of course, the last point is that there could be alternative explanations, so we added the control variables I mentioned earlier. Now, let me show you first some just model-free evidence. So this is just literally average likes, average shares of non-RTM messages and RTM messages. And what you see is that the RTM messages slightly higher, but that difference is not significant. In either case, it's not significant. So when we first did that, even before we ran any model, we just first looked at this, I was expecting something very different. Actually, when I was expecting the RTM messages to be significantly higher in driving engagement, and consistent with the idea that they're providing contextual congruency, and that's expected to make information easier to process, and therefore more likely that the consumers will like it. But that's not what we find. And in fact, when we looked at the results across likes, shares, and comments, we find no significant effect of this, a measure of total real-time, the presence of real-time messages on consumer engagement. And that by itself was a puzzle, right? Like, why? Why is this happening? And that's when this additional distinction became really interesting. So now we started thinking, well, maybe the difference is between planned and improvised. If planned messages are messages that the companies have time to develop and maybe test, or at least have multiple options to assess, maybe they end up producing work that can work better, and maybe improvised messages are being developed faster. Maybe they have more challenges. So we looked at the analysis now by the different types of RTM messages between planned and improvised. And I'm going to show you first, again, model-free evidence, right? So now you have likes, average likes, planned RTM, and improvised RTM. So planned RTM, on average, 3,447 likes. Improvised RTM, 1,333. I should have asked you which one you thought would work better before I showed you the results. But in any case, this was also surprising to us. I mean, it was surprising. It was exciting. It was at the same time, it put us back into thinking what's happening here. Why would this be? Because, in fact, it's a little bit counter what a lot of the discussion was in the media on the popularity of this strategy to gain consumer attention. So we basically ran a similar model that I showed you earlier, but now looking at planned versus improvised, and in that case, we find the different effects. So we find a positive and significant effect of planned RTM messages, and that's the red line. Going from non-RTM to planned RTM, we saw a positive effect on engagement, but we saw a strong negative effect on engagement when adopting an improvised RTM strategy. We looked at that across shares and across comments. Now, across shares and comments, Plan RTM did not make that difference. The difference was primarily on likes. But on improvised, we found a negative effect across the board. So regardless of the dependent variable we use to assess engagement, we are finding that these improvised RTM messages are really not performing as well. And one way of looking at them is that they could become a liability in your social media strategy. Now, not necessarily, and clearly we have seen examples where that has become an asset. But what we're finding is that on average, that's not the case. On average, they're not an asset, even though there are situations where they have been very effective. To understand this better and get to the question of why, we went back to the agencies. And some of you may know that sometimes the companies have these social media centers, or oftentimes they have agency teams that they hire to create them. And the social media centers is basically a combination of a listening center with content creation and media buying, and all these things happen together. It's a fascinating and exciting place, and really a sign of all the new things that are happening in marketing today. So we visited 3 of them, and we also spoke with content managers that created these messages. Our focus really became in trying to explain improvised RTM. Why is this negative? So we interviewed some of the content managers that were creating these messages, and here are some of the pictures of this. Is the social media center that Coca-Cola had in Brazil during the World Cup. So you see, you have a lot of. Some of you have seen these places. At least in my experience, some of them are more sophisticated than others, but they all kind of look the same. A lot of displays with a lot of metrics being updated very rapidly, and many people with laptops running around. And particularly when this is live events, right? When it's kind of regular things, it's more common. But in any case, the point is that they had a team. They had different teams with different roles. One of the teams was actually listening to what was happening. When they found trends or things that could be relevant, that could be that transient context that could become part of their message, they would feed that into the content team for ideas, and the content team would rapidly decide, you know what, a lot of people are talking about the new handshake, okay, new handshake that maybe players are using. So they would literally, get together in the back, 2 people, and they maybe do that new handshake around with their package or their brand, take a picture, send that picture immediately to somebody in the back that was doing production very rapidly, and poof, up it went as a message on Facebook or Twitter. So that process, of course, in the past, it would never happen. Impossible. Legal would have had to approve it, and brand managers or advertising directors would have asked for options because they maybe didn't like one solution, and go through rounds of evaluation, rounds of criticism, and those rounds of criticism could actually kill a great idea or could make it better, depending on the quality of the people that are giving feedback, of course, their knowledge and their experience. But the tension, the creative tension that is established in that process could yield a better result. And what we noticed was that creative tension was missing here. And when we spoke with the the content managers that were actually developing some of these improvised messages, and we asked them, how is the process different to when you are developing your normal social media work? And they talked about the fact that when they were improvising, they had a fast-to-market protocol where they only needed approval from one person. That approval needed to be given within a certain period of time, and that they had liberty. They had more creative liberty. The point is that the creative tension that I spoke earlier that could translate into better work if you have experienced and talented people around it was lacking, was not there. So we began to think that maybe in the process of creating this improvised message, what was really hurting was design effectiveness. that as brands were, trying to get out first with their connection to the context, they were, because speed takes a toll, they were sacrificing design effectiveness. And this, let me make a connection back to Moorman's and Miner's paper in 98, because that was exactly the same theoretical argument that they found empirical evidence for on their work on new product development and improvisation. That improvisation had a negative impact on the success of new products because it reduced design effectiveness. And so we then started exploring, well, in this case, what is design effectiveness, right? And we define it in two ways. One is within creativity, we focused on ingenuity, because we think that's kind of the hardest aspect to get, and it's so important to these types of real-time messages. So we argue that because of the fast-paced process required to develop RTM messages, that creativity was going to go down, particularly ingenuity. The second argument is kind of captured by this example. Just focus on the left side. This was a message that was issued by Curious literally seconds after Malcolm Butler made that incredible interception, and the Patriots won the game, right? And they issued this message that said, everyone's mouth right now with a Curious. Well, if you're watching the Super Bowl and you get that message and you get it at that particular moment, you may understand that. But now imagine that you're not watching the Super Bowl, or that you see that message the day after, right, or hours later. Would that make sense to you? And that was the other explanation we began to explore, that maybe in addition to creativity, understanding was getting hurt, because this improvised message depended very heavily on a context that was even more transient than the ones on plan, right? Because that play happened and it's gone, and you come out with that message immediately, but anybody that sees that message out of that particular narrow context will not get it. So we hypothesized that that improvised message will also hurt understanding, and that both understanding and ingenuity are the key drivers of social media engagement. So we measure both of these factors in our sample, and we found evidence for this. So we find that in both cases, we see a negative effect of improvised RTM messages on understanding, and we find a negative effect of improvised messages on ingenuity. And we also find that both of those factors have a positive effect on social media engagement. Lastly, we looked at a third item which had to do with unexpectedness. And that is, when we discussed with some of the agency people that worked on this, they spoke of being first, and being first in a desire to do something that was surprising, and that they saw that aspect of surprise could drive engagement. And we find that there's a positive effect between improvised messages and unexpectedness, but we did not see unexpectedness as a relevant driver or important driver of social media engagement. Not unexpectedness by itself. It needed to be accompanied by ingenuity and other things. So in a sense, what we're seeing is a scenario where maybe in the pursuit of speed, content managers could sacrifice very important elements that drive effectiveness, and maybe they're not even noticing that's the case because the process is moving so fast. Now, lastly, I'll try to move quickly through the last set of questions. We looked at how can you reverse this negative effect, and we looked at two things. One was product symbols. If the issue is understanding, we thought that if the message is designed using more clear and recognizable product symbols, that would help the understanding of the message. And a brand that has probably mastered this, I think, frankly, not a very insightful opinion. I think the Oreo is one of the best creators of social media content at many levels. And one of them is the way that they use their product symbols, right? The product itself as embedded in the message. And we believe that when that happens, it facilitates the understanding. The other hypothesis we had was around the focus of the audience. Again, If the audience is too broad and you are putting a message out there that depends on the audience to know that particular context, and that context is narrow, you're really going to be communicating with people that are likely not to get your message. So we thought that the more targeted the message was, more to your core audience, the more likely that it would be effective. So we looked at both of these moderating effects, improvisation. So that's, you see those results in the bottom, the interaction between product symbols and improvised RTM, and the interaction between audience mix, so targeting and improvised RTM. And we see that in both cases, they reverse a negative effect on likes. So they make improvised RTM an asset again. They make it have a positive effect on likes. Also on shares in the case of product symbols. Comments, there may be other things happening there. We did not see the effect, but we did see it on likes and partly on shares. So what do we think this means? Even if taking a step back, we think real-time messages are really a completely new capability that it's not, it goes beyond the ability to produce messages with high immediacy. It may require a different process, a different skill set. And we even began thinking that this capability of real-time messages may be closer to the capability of improv comedy. And maybe the people that are working on real-time content should actually get their skills from improv rather than from traditional content generation experiences. Because it's not necessarily that improvisation will lead to damaging creativity and understanding, but it's very likely to happen if you're not trained on this level of improvisation. At least that's what we believe, what our results are suggesting. Also, the fact that particularly these are two things that are at risk. So we believe that with these findings, we give managers, and particularly the content creators, maybe possibly on the agency side, more direction on what to be on the lookout for. What's at risk with this process? It's ingenuity and it's understanding. There may be a few other things, but at least those two. So there's an element of creativity and understanding. So those could become checkpoints now in the approval process. Is this passing our gate in terms of clarity of understanding? Is this passing our gate in terms of creativity? If so, then move on. We believe it can give managers more clarity on what to look for in terms of mitigating this possible risk. Okay? And lastly is the point that I spoke earlier, that in a way, and this actually was one of the comments from one of the managers that we interviewed, that when he was reflecting on the things that had to change, was his reflection that real time was actually require a lot of planning. But to do real-time communications work, they needed to have a lot of clarity on what the brand voice was ahead of time. They need to have a lot of clarity on the brand positioning. They need to have a lot of clarity on what messages to communicate and not communicate. They needed to have a lot of clarity on what context to associate with and which ones not. So it's almost like they started this process excited about the possibility of creating content fast and immediate at a low cost, and then halfway through realize, well, hold on, this actually requires a lot more strategy and planning and preparation than we expected. And added a dimension that maybe is new to also marketing communications, which is scenario planning. That's not something that, when in the, almost saying the old way, but in the more traditional media, it was less scenario planning because you didn't have the opportunity to change your message once you produced it and issued it in the marketplace. I mean, you could, but it was at a very high cost. As the cost of change goes down, scenario planning becomes really an important consideration and almost capability. And that's another aspect that managers spoke to, and I think our research could help on. What are we working on in the future? We think that, I talked about the organization capability of improv marketing. That's an area that we want to look into it further. Also, different types of context. It may be that maybe by platform, This effect varies. Maybe in Instagram, this is different. Certainly in Twitter, this could be different. So right now, we can only speak of this phenomenon in Facebook. And then behavioral effects, right? So where are we looking at engagement? But what most managers care about is not that, right? The engagement is just an interim metric to what managers really care about, which is persuasion, choice, impact on demand or desire of the product. So looking at how these improvised messages or real-time messages impact persuasion differently than traditional messages, I think is another important area of opportunity. And with that, I'll stop. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll take any questions that Gordon chooses.
Thank you very much, Omar. You're right on schedule, and it's a great presentation, and we do have some time for a few questions. We've had a few come in so far, and I just want to encourage you to use the chat with presenter function if you have other questions that you want to send in while we're talking. Couple things people have raised on sort of the measurement or the methodological issues maybe can help us understand. You noticed on your variables in your models you had positive and negative emotions as controls. And how did you measure those?
Yeah, good question. Again, a lot of these measures were tagged via MTurk with consumers. So those in particular, we broke it down across, I think it was 8 or 10 different emotions based on what the research literature has established on what are emotions in advertising. Those include joy, happiness, sadness, etc. So we have people tag the extent to which those emotions were present in the content.
So the content is what actually... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the content is the combination of the images or the video along with the text that was used. And then we also try to use the text analysis on this and look at the extent to which the words that were used in the post were associated with some emotions, but we didn't get far on that. We had some trouble making that work, and we were also concerned that many of these posts were relying heavily on images. So text analysis on emotions when you're ignoring the content, the emotional content of the image or the video would not have made as much sense. So we try to tag the whole message together.
Okay, thank you. One question was about sort of thinking ahead to how to apply this. The example would be in mobile. Would you consider marketing to users who approach your store in a real-time marketing sense for a different category? So the example of Starbucks messaging users who are driving by or close to a Starbucks location. Does that fit with how you think this might?
Yeah, that is it's kind of what we alluded to by the different usages of this strategy. I would suspect that would we would find different results if it came down. If you were able to target users that are users of your product and that are in close proximity to your transactions, and you have the right. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that the results we share today would be consistent in that setting. So this is a different setting, right? This is more. Right. This is less promotionally driven. It's more brand driven.
Yeah. So a different context. And you already addressed this one question to an extent about how this might work on different platforms, saying basically your research is on the Facebook platform. But can you speculate too a little bit in terms of would this? Do you think it would change results dramatically if you were on Twitter, Snapchat?
You know what? I think so. Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. I think it's really hard to make any general statements about social media. I think consumers' behaviors vary significantly across platforms. What they use it for, how they relate to the content. So I think it's each platform, it's a different world, and we would have to replicate this study on Twitter and on Instagram and some others to begin to formulate some more generalizable insights across. But even then, I would caution against that. I think it's important for marketers to think of these platforms as differently in terms of how consumers use them and experience them, and then plan accordingly, rather than use content like in the old days. We would use the same ad, across different TV channels, and sometimes even images from the ad on billboard. That's, I don't think, the right approach in a multi-channel world that we live in today.
Yeah, my interpretation is that I think you're saying, that this idea of real-time marketing came up perhaps because of the technology existed, and then you're looking at it systematically and saying, well, you actually need to use some of the tools of planning to get the most out of it. It doesn't sort of run itself automatically. Yeah. You've actually got to build the skills and the capabilities to think in terms of real time, which is a little bit different than the traditional media planning.
Yes. And I think to build on that, just the fact that you are embedding a context in your message and publishing it in proximity of that event gives you no guarantee of success. That's almost price of entry. You need to secure understanding and ingenuity, and if that's not there, you're just going to go unnoticed, unless you have support from media. So, for instance, if your post is picked up by the media and gets covered and all that, then suddenly, it becomes very successful. And clearly that you need some aspects of ingenuity and understanding for that to happen anyway.
So. Yeah. Another question, have you looked at and tried to classify all the messages into different events? So, for example, within football, versus pre-event versus during the event versus the final day, would the different timings of the event attract different?
I get. I think that would be an important follow-up study, because we were limited in terms of our ability to know actual distance from published moment, right? We didn't have that information. So, but that it's more of a demand side view on the question, which, by the way, I think it's equally important. I think we took a supply side approach to study this. We, in fact, are looking for ways of trying to take a demand side and complement our story and our research with it. And maybe other scholars can take a shot at it as well. But I think you're right. I think that demand side would add tremendous value to our insights of how this works.
Well, you stimulated a lot of questions. Let me just focus on a couple more. One was in regard to the correlations that you observed between the different types of engagement, the likes, the shares, and the comments. Any thoughts about those correlations? I guess, if I remember correctly, what you said was they were all pretty much independent of each other. There wasn't high degree of...
No. Between the likes, shares, and comments are dependent variables, right?
Yeah.
So those three are correlated. But that's not the moment that becomes a problem is if I don't account for that correlation in our analysis. So we did that by doing a system of equations.
Right.
But what's important is that our independent variables are not highly correlated. So that's what I was referring to when I showed the correlation matrix.
Okay, so no collinearity on the independent variables. So in terms of, the correlation you do observe, does that give you any other kind of question or thought about the fact that they are correlated and how that might play out in your analysis? I guess they're correlated, but not necessarily highly or not very highly correlated.
Well, they are, but as long as we are accounting for that correlation by using robust standard errors and and running the analysis simultaneously, which is taking into account the fact that the 3 dependent variables are correlated, we should be fine. That shouldn't be biasing our results.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's fully taken into account is the conclusion from that. Okay, I think we're running up pretty close to our end here. If others have, we didn't get to all the questions. You really did generate a lot of interesting ones. So I want to thank everybody for sending the questions. Thank you, Omar, for giving the presentation on this research. And if people in the audience do have additional questions, additional things you'd like to discuss, please do reach out to Omar directly at omar.rodriguez@scheller.gatech.edu, Georgia Tech EDU. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you particularly, Omar, and look forward to seeing you.
Thank you, Gordon, for the support on the project.
Yep. And
thank you, guys. Have a wonderful day.
Our next webinar will be the one on content marketing using media content to create brand value with Bobby Calder on July 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So look forward to seeing you then, and once again, thanks to everybody.